hope you can all see my screen. So yeah, just as short, I will talk a little bit about my experiences with pre-registration, but I also thought it might be worthwhile to share experiences from my colleagues. So everything that I heard about, I also did a few surveys about pre-registration, and I just thought I'm just going to share a little bit of that as well. So yeah, I was already introduced. So I'm one of the organizers of the Open Science Community Amsterdam. On the screen, you can also see our Twitter handle. I'm in my last year of my PhD right now. And my department is a little bit special in the sense that my supervisor is a big open science advocate. So basically, right from the start, I had to pre-register all my studies that I conducted. And these were a total of 7 studies so far. And also part of my research, as I said, focuses on open science practices. And I must say, my experience might be a bit biased because my field or my departments is really supportive. But overall, I got a really positive feedback about pre-registering studies and endorsing those open science practices. And that's not only from my supervisors and colleagues, but also from the grant organizations. They really liked when I said that I'm going to pre-register my studies, but also from reviewers or editors. From my personal experience, I didn't hear anything bad so far, and I also never got like evil reviewers that were complaining about my pre-registration. I must say that pre-registering the studies shifted the workload a little bit. So instead of having to think about what kind of analysis you want to conduct and how to best pre-process your data after you collected the data, you kind of have to think about it beforehand. So you have, in general, when you conduct a study, more work upfront to do. And after data collection, because you already pre-registered the study, it goes really quick towards the end. And I would say that for me personally, it was really a learning curve. So the studies or my first pre-registrations were like way worse than the ones that I write now, just because I have more experiences on how to phrase certain things and also what to include in a pre-registration. So I would think that also if you want to start pre-registering, just be aware that the first ones you write, you will probably make mistakes, and that's fine. Now I want to say something about the experiences from colleagues, and I first start with negative experiences, and then I will go into the positive experiences. So a lot of colleagues said that pre-registering is more work than not pre-registering, and I think I would agree with that. So that could have multiple causes. So some people argue that it's actually not more work, it's just this shift in workload that people are experiencing. So because they have to do more work before they're collecting data, they just think that it's more work to actually pre-register. On the other hand, it's also true that besides writing your manuscript, you also have to write kind of the second document, which is your pre-registration. So in my opinion, it is more work than if you wouldn't pre-register at all. But then again, I would also say that this writing of pre-registration, it might delay your project by a few weeks, but definitely not months in general. Other colleagues also said that it can increase stress, and that's, for instance, with projects that have really fixed dates for data collection. For instance, when you need to go into a school to research students and you have to be there at a certain date, you know that when data collection starts, the whole pre-registration has to be written before that. So that can be quite stressful. Or also if you're in your last months of your contract and you really have to finish the study, it might increase your stress to pre-register a study. That's also something to think about. And then lastly, it's important to say that some research might be more difficult to pre-register. So the studies that I'm usually doing, they're survey studies or experiments that have really clear data structures. but there are also really complex data sets out there. So for instance, if you do fMRI research or you work with EEG data, the whole data pre-processing can be really complex, and it can be really difficult to pre-register those steps. And also, if you're working with certain scales, it can be quite difficult, because a lot of researchers, before they start analyzing the data, they do some data-dependent choices based on factor analyses, for instance. And that is also hard to pre-register, because the model that you test in the end includes some data-dependent choices. So you cannot really do it without the collected data. And you can also just have complex models in general. If you have, I don't know, some longitudinal Bayesian analyses, then that's also just quite hard to pre-register in general if you don't have the data at hand. And I think the most important thing is that it happens that you need to deviate from your analysis plan. So we saw it in Schurz's talk already that it can happen. And it also happened in my projects. And it's just something to be aware of, and also something you shouldn't be scared of. It happens that there will be like some errors in your code, or so something that you didn't expect beforehand. And you just need to be honest about that in your report. And usually reviewers and editors also understand that. And based on that, I have 2 examples. One example is from Dutil et al. And they had a really complex longitudinal study on working memory. And they also had a Bayesian model that they developed themselves, basically. And after they collected the data, they realized that the model that they had pre-registered actually didn't work. There was some error in the codes, and also from a theoretical standpoint, it didn't make sense. So basically, they had to really deviate from their analysis plan, because they only recognized this mistake beforehand. And then another example was from the reproducibility project in cancer biology. So here it was a lot of teams doing replication studies, and they basically just pre-registered the exact analysis that the original authors did. And one example was from Horrigan, and he researched cancer treatments in mice. So they had 2 groups of mice that had tumors, and one group was treated with like a cancer medicine, and the other group was treated with a placebo. And what happened there, that the mice that were treated with a placebo started to spontaneous heal the tumors themselves. So this is, of course, something that you wouldn't pre-register, you cannot account beforehand, but it will influence your analysis. So also here they had to deviate from their analysis plan. And my personal negative experience, so from the 7 studies that I pre-registered, in one, I had a programming error in there. So I pre-registered that the study materials would be presented randomized, but they weren't in the end, which was not a problem. It was basically a footnote in the article, and the reviews didn't really complain about it. Then in a different study, we pre-registered a paired analysis. So we wanted to have 2 equal sized groups that we compare with each other. But since it was a survey study, one group ended up much bigger than the other group. So also here we had to deviate from our analysis plan. And one study, which was my first pre-registration, actually never got conducted, because we started to write the pre-registration, and I figured out that the way I wanted to analyze the data was too complex, and I had to basically develop a new method to analyze the data, and that got a bit overwhelming. So basically that study then, that project, we just quit, and we didn't work on it anymore, which might also be positive, because I didn't realize that after the data collection, I realized it before. So let's go to the positive experiences. So in general, at least in the social sciences, I hear a lot that reviewers and editors react positively if you submit a paper that was pre-registered. They think it's more credible in general. And reviewers and editors also in general accept deviations from your analysis plan. So basically, if you have a section in your paper that states the deviations and you're honest about it, then usually it's not a problem, at least from what I hear. Then also a lot of people say that it leads to better data and project management because it forces you to think about the data structures and variables already pretty early on in the process. So you might not end up with like really complex big data sets that you don't really know what to do with them. And it also improves the communications with collaborators and supervisors. So I also made that experience because I wrote the pre-registration before I put my pre-registration on the open science framework. I really have to sit down with all of my collaborators and supervisors, and they have to agree with this analysis plan. So also my supervisors have to really think about that project. And I think that's a big benefit because usually they're a bit more detached from the projects, and then they only give comments once everything is finished already. Yeah, so in general, I just want to emphasize, also Sjoerd said it before, that with pre-registration doesn't rule out exploratory analyses. You just have to label them as such. Also, my papers usually have a confirmatory analysis section with everything that I pre-registered, and then also an exploratory analysis section where we do like all kinds of explorations and additional things. So that is still possible, and also reviewers are okay with that. And we basically take on this additional workload because we want to increase the credibility of the results and combat this like implicit or explicit form of significance seeking. So I also have a few tips on where to start. So in general, a pre-registration is just like a PDF or a Word document, which was time-stamped in a way, and which is public, and which it includes also your analysis plan. And if you're really good about it, also your analysis code, and you can write it on your own. So basically just open Word and start outlining your analysis steps, or you can use a template, for instance, the aspredicted.org that Sjoerd already mentioned. And in general, what you need to specify is one which I think is really important, all your data pre-processing steps. So how you operationalize your variables, which outliers you will remove, and how you handle missing data, because those usually have big influences on the results in the end. And then also your statistical models, so your key dependent and independent variables, which moderators you're gonna include, and so on. And there are some things to account for when pre-registering studies. So it should be in general, as specific and precise as possible. So I'm always get told that if you give the data and your analysis plan that you pre-register to a colleague, they should end up doing the exact same analyses as you. So there should be really every single analysis step kind of outlined in there. And I think this is best achieved when you actually submit code, because then you don't have to write it much, and then it's just crystal clear which variables you're going to exclude and so on. And what also makes sense is to maybe account for potential peculiarities in the data. For instance, if the statistical tests that you choose have some assumptions that have to be met, then what are you doing if those assumptions are not met? So it's also a bit handy to have like some alternative analysis ways if the data looks differently than normal. So in general, my workflow looks like this. If I have a research question, I always try to make it as concrete and testable as possible. So we usually don't start with really vague ideas. We start with research questions that we already kind of have a test in mind of how to assess it. And then we already start thinking about the data structure. So how is the data going to look like from like the survey that we want to give people, for instance. And based on this data structure, I think that's for me really crucial, and the most helpful step when pre-registering is that I create dummy data. So so that means I either simulate data that kind of looks like the data I would expect, or I use data from pilot studies from me or my collaborators, or I use some kind of existing data from research that is quite similar to what I'm doing now. And what I'm doing then is I create an analysis pipeline based on this dummy data. So my pre-registration in the end is a combination of a written document, something like a method section, and also my analysis code. And I think this is one of the biggest mistakes of people who pre-registered, that they never actually wrote the code. And I think a lot of those deviations and mistakes can be avoided when you actually write code, or you have some kind of SPSS syntax or something like that. You actually click and analyze data before. And there are a couple of helpful tools. So Sjoerd already mentioned the aspredicted.org website. I think that's really good. I also worked on a transparency checklist. So this is a checklist you can use for all your empirical research, not only the one that you pre-registered, but it's basically a checklist created by open science advocates and also editors from leading psychology journals about which aspects they think like your method section in a research paper should include, but also your pre-registration should include. And it's just, I think, like 30 questions or so. It takes you 5 minutes to just go through it, and then you can see in your pre-registration whether some crucial information is missing or not. So I would really recommend checking this out. And then the other one that Sjoerd also already mentioned is the Open Science Framework. That is the usual go-to website when you want to pre-register stuff. In there, you can also share data and code, but you can also store your pre-registration. So your pre-registration will have a certain timestamp on it, so you can prove to the editor and reviewer that you actually pre-registered before you start data collection. You can officially register your pre-registration, so it can't get deleted. And it also offers pre-registration templates, so specific questions that you can just answer. And I think that's really handy as well. So last but not least, I think if you never pre-registered before, it's good to collaborate with researchers who have a little bit of experience, just because then it goes faster, and it might take away a little bit from the anxiety one could have when they pre-register for the first time. You can also speak with other colleagues or members from the open science community. So I have here our email address. You can contact us, and we also have Zoom meetings with researchers who have questions about their pre-registration. So I think that could be really helpful, and also just like data conversations that we have right now, where you just exchange your experiences. And also there's tons of tutorial papers out there on how a good pre-registration should look like. And then as last step, a lot of people getting intimidated because they don't want to risk like a good publication when they try out pre-registration. So I also let all my students, so bachelor and master thesis students, pre-register their studies. And I think that's a good first step to start, to just try out this way of doing research together with your students, because usually they need to submit some kind of proposal anyway. And then the step to actually doing a pre-registration with them is not that big, and usually their studies also are not the ones that get published, so it's also low risk, and then you can just try out whether you like this format or not. And that's it. Thank you very much.